You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael, on a Monday here, getting back into the swing of things. Hope everybody had a good weekend. Joined by returning guest, Pat Flynn, and fellow apologist. How you doing, sir?
I'm great, my friend. How are you?
Doing good, and I noticed you have grown the beard out.
Well, I moved to Wisconsin 3 years ago, so it's time that I finally embrace it with the beard and flannel.
I didn't know you were in Wisconsin.
Yes, sir. Waukesha, Wisconsin. I was born in Pennsylvania, moved around a lot when I was a kid, but I grew up in Wisconsin a little bit, and then my wife and I returned here to be closer to family about 3 years ago.
Oh, okay. So you have family there. That's good. That's
we literally live in the same neighborhood as my dad.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Makes Thanksgiving and all that very easy.
Yeah. Not as much traveling involved. That's definitely convenient. That's partly one of the reasons why I returned from New York years ago back to Louisiana, because I have family here and I didn't have any family in New York. So
it makes a difference, man. It really does.
Yes,
it really does. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's fun. I totally agree. I want to talk about philosophical approaches to God. And in fact, I think you recently wrote a paper or an article on this. Is that right?
Yeah, I've got two under review right now that explore, again, my favorite thing to explore, which is cosmological reasoning. And so I'm always thinking about this stuff, and I'm always thinking about it from different angles and trying to explore new paths and different insights. And I was thinking, what's my motivation for that? Do I not think that the other arguments I've explored are good? I don't think that's the case. I think it's always good to have, different ways of thinking about things. But I see, I see it as trying to gain a better insight into the nature of God and God's relationship to us. So philosophy, for me, is a tool that obviously can only get you so far, and then theology and revelation has to take over. But I'm always really interested to see how far can that philosophical project actually be pushed. So yeah, I've been thinking about some alternative forms of cosmological reasoning that are not entirely original to me, but I don't think have gotten enough attention in the contemporary conversation, if that makes sense.
And before we get into those, what exactly is your preference? What's the heavy hitter one for you?
Yeah, so if we're sticking to the family of cosmological arguments, and it's important for people to know that this is a family of arguments. There's not just like the cosmological argument, right? I sometimes like to break it out into two traditions. There's a sort of Leibnizian approach to cosmological reasoning. And if people aren't familiar with that, the way that typically proceeds is like this. You start by trying to justify some sort of explanatory or causal principle. Often this is known as the principle of sufficient reason. And the trick there is to try and get just the right principle, right? A principle that's, that can be adequately defended and hopefully very robustly to say, look, if you deny this principle, you're going to be in all sorts of trouble. And all the better if you can show that you need this principle to even make sense of rationality and knowledge and stuff like that, which a lot of thinkers do. And I think those are really good defenses. But you also don't want the principle to be so beefed up that it might give you issues if you're a theist. So an overly extravagant principle would be something like everything has a cause, right? Okay. That seems like that's going to be an issue, right? Because clearly not everything can have a cause, right? Part of the cosmological argument is supposed to show that there has to be at least one thing that exists uncausedly, right?
Sure.
So the principle of sufficient reason will typically be restricted, and it will say, well, everything of the type contingent has a cause, or everything of the type composite has a cause, or something like that. So there's different formulations out there, but that's a general idea. And then what happens from there is that principle is sort of applied to, if we're talking about contingent things, it's applied to contingent facts, plural, or just put all the contingent facts together and say, look, to explain why there's anything of the type contingent. And for people who aren't familiar, when we say that something is contingent, we really say it is, but it didn't have to be or could have been otherwise, right? There's nothing sort of intrinsic to the nature of a contingent thing that demands it be included in reality, right? So if we need to kind of explain why is there anything of the type contingent at all, it seems we need to make a little bit of a category shift, which means we need some necessary being, some necessary reality, right, to explain why there's any contingent thing at all. And that's often called stage one of the cosmological argument, the Leibnizian one. Stage two then goes and tries to run a conceptual analysis on the idea of a necessary being and try and unpack what exactly that is. And for theists, anyways, the project usually involves trying to show how it entails divine attributes of classical theism. So that's the Leibnizian tradition. Then there's what I call the broadly Thomistic position, and I've been interested in exploring and defending an approach from Barry Miller, who I think is a really brilliant philosopher, but he's tragically overlooked. And part of the reason he's overlooked, and Michael, I'm sure you find people like this in theology, is he's just so technical and unforgiving, right? Yeah. He's one of those guys where it's like he does zero hand holding. It's like you either are ready for the big boy conversation or we're leaving you in the dust, right? Yeah. And his work is there's a lot of it, so like you can't blame people for like making the judgment, like, I don't know if I want to invest the time in this because there's a lot here. And it seems like it'll take a lot of effort to understand. And I guess my petition is it's worth it for this guy. Right. But anyways, he's kind of in the family of Thomistic arguments, and the work there is going to be a little bit different. There's going to be a little bit more metaphysical work up front, but Miller's argument proceeds sort of like this. He's going to argue that you take a sort of something like Thumper the rabbit, right? A little bunny rabbit, right? And he's going to say, he's going to ask, well, why is this rabbit contingent, right? Well, it's contingent because following Aquinas, its essence is really internally distinct from its existence, right? That its rabbitness does not demand that it be included in reality. So what Miller does brilliantly is he sort of analyzes the deeper metaphysics of the matter, following Aquinas, but adding many novel contributions of his own. And he's going to say, well, let's take the entity Thumper the rabbit and just think about it, right? It exists, but however can it be that Thumper the rabbit exists, right? He's got two fundamental metaphysical co-principles: his essence, his what determination, and his active existence, his sort of whether determination, if you want to call it that, right? How did these things sort of ever come together? How did we ever get the composite Thumper the rabbit? And Miller actually draws out some really fascinating contradictory implications. So what he wants to say is like, look, Thumper's existence, his existence part, crucially depends upon Thumper for it to be individualized, right? For it to be the existence of Thumper rather than some other rabbit, right? So in a sense, Thumper, the essence part, is actually more fundamental than the existence part, at least conceptually so, for the construction of this entity, right? This is a complex argument. I'm going to give the simplest summary I can right now, right? But then he'll say, here's the other problem, however. Thumper, apart from his existence, is nothing. Right? He can't do anything, including complete or individuate his existence. So now we have a problem, right? Because Thumper's existence is dependent, and it's dependent upon Thumper. But Thumper, apart from his existence, is nothing. But to be dependent upon nothing is just not to be dependent at all. So then we have this contradictory implication of both a dependent and not dependent structure. And what Miller ultimately concludes is this. He says, unless Thumper exists is a suppressed proposition, an elliptical proposition. It's sort of shorthand for something more. Then Thumper is a contradictory structure and cannot exist. And then you can ask, well, what is it? What is that short for? What does Thumper? What is this suppressed proposition? And Miller wants to say, whenever we say Thumper exists, what we really mean to say is that Thumper exists qua dependent upon X or A, and X or A being some sort of extrinsic unifier of Thumper's metaphysical constituents. And then Miller goes into your typical sort of regress considerations, and he's going to say that analysis will apply for any entity like Thumper that has this real metaphysical distinction between essence and existence. So the only way some being like that could exist, even if there is a regress of causes, is if that regress of causes is necessarily terminating. He uses the language of a necessarily terminating causal series, where we get back to something whose essence just is its existence, right? And that's pretty classic Thomism from that point. So I find that fascinating. I have like I said, I have an article under review where I try to develop and defend that argument. But the reason I like it, Michael, and the difference is it requires no upfront commitment to the principle of sufficient reason, right? Or anything like that. It's just trying to tease out, the contradictory implications of just one thing, right? And we're not even thinking about the universe of the whole. It's like, how can Thumper, this one thing, exist here now? And his argument is only if God causes it. Now there's work to be done there still. So it's important, as you know, with theology and everything else, no argument comes for free, right? It's like, where do you want to do your work or your battles? So with the Leibnizian tradition, I see most of the work being done in trying to justify the PSR, right? I think if you give somebody PSR, you pretty much get them to God. In fact, my buddy Jim had a professor who's a very well-known atheist, Bill Rowe, And he said to him in conversation one time, he's like, yeah, if you think PSR is true, you probably should be a theist, right? And I think that's a right assessment, right? So I think that's where most of the work for the Leibnizian tradition comes in. For the more Thomistic version, it's really that background metaphysics. You have to kind of show that existence is this thick thing, kind of like my beard, as you noticed, right? It's a first level property of concrete individuals, which is of course a very controversial claim. So what I do in my papers, I try to motivate that and say, no, actually this is right. Existence is something that we predicate of individuals. It's a very special kind of property. So we can't think of it as most other properties that inhere in individuals, because there's nothing for existence to adhere in prior to that thing existing. So we have to kind of work through that puzzle, and I follow Miller and the solution to that. I think it's a good solution, and kind of work against other more modern theories of existence, which try to say that existence is just a property of concepts. It's a second level property. So the point out here is that no matter what, you're going to have to work somewhere on cosmological reasoning. If you want to like work in the tall grass of existence, the Thomistic approach, I think, will be for you. And I actually, real quick, and then I want to get your thoughts, is that I love Aquinas. You asked what my favorite is. I actually like the Thomistic approach better. And the reason is I like to do metaphysics. So I like to work and really think about what the heck is existence? What is the status of existence? You know, is it a nature? What is the content of its nature? I like those questions, right? And the Thomistic tradition seems to be much more involved in trying to figure those difficult things out. But then at the end of the day, I think the Thomistic position gives you a more robust picture of contingency and God to begin with, right? We can explain why things are contingent according to Thomism. Why? Because they're composite. Things are contingent insofar as they are composite, right? That's a nice explanation of contingency. Their essence is really distinct from their existence. We can also explain why God is necessary, which seems like something we should want to explain. I've never been deeply satisfied with cosmological arguments that just say, well, God's necessary and that's it. Well, a naturalist can say that some physical reality is necessary for whatever reason. So like we need to like motivate the necessity. Why is something necessary? And Thomism gives us the answer. Its essence just is to exist, right? Yeah.
But if it's physical, wouldn't that then mean it's composite in some sense? And then that introduces contingency. Help me out there.
Yeah, no, all physical entities presumably have at least spatial parts, right? So they are composite, but on the Thomistic analysis, they're always composites, at least to form a matter and essence and existence. For the Thomistic, for the Thomistic route, it is important that, and Miller and Aquinas do this, that they first sort of entertain a hypothetical. If there were something whose essence, what is its existence, what would that something be like? And they argued that it would be uniquely unique. You couldn't have more than one instance of this type of thing. It wouldn't be susceptible to multiplication because there'd be no way to
differentiate.
Right. Yeah. And we can talk about that if you want. One sort of quick way to motivate that is just suppose there are two individual instances, right, of that which just is its existence, subsistent existence following Aquinas, right? Call them Frank and Bob for fun, right? So if Frank and Bob are distinct, then the existence of Frank is distinct from the existence of Bob. But in that case, the existence of each individual is individuated by that which it is the existence of, right? The existence of Bob is individuated by Bob, and the existence of Frank is individuated by Frank. Hence, they're really distinct from their existence, right? So that's... But by hypothesis, we said it can't be really distinct from its existence. So you get these absurdities, right, where there really cannot be more than one being whose essence just is its existence, right?
Yeah.
So anything that's like multipliable, electrons, anything physical, really, right? Thumper the rabbit can't be that sort of thing, right? And then there's other implications that Aquinas unpacks from subsistent existence would have to be purely actual, as you said, Michael, and you can kind of daisy chain the divine attributes from there. But you're right. I think the Thomistic route gives you an in-principle reason of why no physical material reality could ever be that sort of fundamental metaphysical stopping point, if that makes sense.
It does. And I wonder, if there are implications here on the Trinity. And how maybe so that works out.
It's a tricky, right? It's very tricky. I'm not a specialist in it, but I'll say I had a conversation with James Dolezal on simplicity and Trinity, because definitely Aquinas is committed to a strong form of divine simplicity. Miller is as well. I don't think Miller spends as much time on the Trinity, but there's two guys I would go to see how you can work through these issues in a satisfactory, to my mind anyway. Those two guys are Bernard Lonergan, his systematics, and James Dolezal, who actually develops a good amount of Lonergan's thought. So yeah, no, there's at least some initial tensions there that need to be worked through. I'm not a Trinitarian specialist, but that's where I found my personal I think I think this actually really works type of account, right?
Sure. Now let's talk maybe about some of the arguments that aren't your favorites, some of these other alternatives that you've been thinking about that you think may be workable. What are some other approaches?
Yeah, well, let me ask you first. What do you like?
What are you... The argument from contingency is my preference, but I don't know enough about this as much as you do. So, yeah. But for me, in the little that I have an introduction to the subject, that seems to be the most convincing. I remember whenever I was at Christendom, we had to take some classes on philosophy before we got to theology. Theology is more my expertise, but obviously you have to have some philosophy to do also theology. Right. And we went over the 5 arguments that Aquinas offers. I found the argument from contingency to be the most interesting.
And you would say that's his third way, I take it?
Yeah. Yeah. So I found that to be helpful, but then again, I also don't know all of the different views out there to really properly evaluate every one of them to know which one is the most effective.
Yeah, well, let's break it down into categories, and then maybe I can answer your question. I promise I'm not dodging it. I have definite feelings on like what are my favorite. Aquinas is the broadly Thomistic one is my absolute favorite. It's what ultimately convinced me when I was a naturalist. So people don't know, I used to be a naturalist, right? And it didn't like convince me overnight, but as I studied it more and more and the different forms of it, I just came to see like, yeah, I think this is a good argument, right? And in other ways, I think other arguments actually sort of bleed into contingency and cosmological arguments at the end of the day, including moral arguments, but we can get to that in a minute. But there's kind of like 2 different so we'll break out 2 different categories again. There's sort of the old approach and the new approach of using philosophy to get to God. And the old approach is sort of what I described with Aquinas. You start with what's in front of you and you start trying to carve reality at its joints. Aristotle started in philosophy of nature, and then he thinks that breaks into metaphysics, right? The study of being as being. Philosophy of nature is a study of mobile being, then metaphysics is a study of being as being. And then he thinks like to affirm reality as intelligible, to give adequate explanation of everything that stands in need of explanation, you're going to need the God, right? And this is often called like a metaphysical demonstration. And this is again how Aquinas's arguments work, but it's important to understand they have a huge amount of metaphysical buttressing or metaphysical backdrop to them. But the idea is like once you've kind of rolled up your flannel sleeves and done the metaphysics, God's existence is really sort of just inescapable, right? It's just a package deal to secure all those other commitments. What are they? How to make sense of change, how to make sense of compositeness, contingency, teleology is Aquinas' 5th way that you mentioned there, right? So while they take more metaphysical upfront work, the idea of a metaphysical demonstration is like we can know that God exists with certainty, in fact, right? With certainty. And that's a very strong method of reasoning. I think it's right. I've defended it, but it's not the only approach to God. The more modern approach is sort of like this, right? You form various competing large-scale hypotheses, like large-scale theories of everything. Call them a worldview, right? So you form a theistic worldview, and maybe there's different kinds of theistic worldviews. So you're kind of like crafting this hypothesis together, right? Let me shape it this way, right? And then what you do is you go out to Buffalo Wild Wings with friends who have different worldview hypotheses, and you sit down and you order you should go blazing if you're going to go Buffalo Wild Wings, go all the way, and you try to agree upon relevant data that needs to be explained by a worldview, right? So you try to say, okay, friend, as we eat these chicken wings, let us try and decide what are features of the world that really need to be explained by a large-scale theory of everything. Now, that itself is tough, right? And this is one of the problems. So you can see like this problem is sort of like this approach is more scientific, but applied to philosophy on a meta level, right? You're forming a hypothesis, you're seeing what that hypothesis predicts or explains, and at the end of the day, you're going to hopefully go with the hypothesis that predicts and explains the most with the least, right? It makes the most sense of the data that we think stands in need of an explanation and can do so in a way that's, not too ad hoc, relatively simple. It satisfies certain theoretical virtues and stuff like that. So you're sitting down, eating those chicken wings, and you're saying, okay, here's some data that I think needs to be explained. There are contingent things. There are conscious beings. There is teleology, normativity. There are moral facts. There's moral knowledge, right? There's religious experiences, so on and so forth, whatever you think it is, right? Now, again, that's a tricky part of the debate because just as data can determine a theory, theory can sometimes determine data, and not everybody is going to agree on the data to be explained. Take morality, for example, right? Like, are there moral facts, right? As represented by true moral claims, such as it is always wrong to kill everybody on earth just because you're having a really bad day, right? There's going to be people who deny that that's actually something that is like a data point to be explained. And then you can ask, well, why would they think that? Because it seems like most of us like do think that there are moral facts. Maybe we haven't worked out how to secure them, right? But maybe they're denying it because they already have a metaphysical background like naturalism and Darwinism that causes them to think that morality is or moral beliefs or something that arose purely through processes that are survival conducive, not truth conducive, right? So we form these sort of false but useful beliefs that help us to avoid bears, have sex, and occasionally get to Buffalo Wild Wings, right? So now we've got an issue on like the data to be explained, right? And so that's problematic, right? Because you can't really engage in hypothesis testing if you can't really. I'm not saying this is like totally demolishes this approach. It's just a problem with this approach that needs to be clarified before you can meaningfully engage in it, right? So yeah, I think there are moral facts, and I think it's undeniable that there are moral facts. So if your worldview can't account for moral facts, then sorry, like you're off the table of options as far as I'm concerned. Now somebody can push back and say, well, that's just Pat just being a dogmatist again. And then I'll have to try and argue and defend moral realism, and I think you can do that not just through intuition, but tying it together with other with epistemic normativity. Like it seems like moral facts and epistemic facts, or moral norms and epistemic norms, are tightly bound. If you try to take one down, you take the other down. So if you're going to try and take morality down, you'll probably take reason down, right? Or else you're being really arbitrary in how you try and parse this out. Yeah.
Are you referring to brute facts here?
No, a brute fact. Now, somebody might just call a moral fact a brute fact, right?
Yeah.
Somebody might, well, it's just brute that there are moral facts and they exist necessarily, and that's just brute too, right? And that's deeply unsatisfactory. It goes back to what I've talked about before. For many reasons. One, just calling something necessary doesn't make it so. We have many examples where we can explain necessary truths in other instances, but what we shouldn't just immediately think that even if something is a necessary truth, it doesn't have a deeper explanation. So that's one thing. Another thing is that if you have a particular worldview that is already inclining you towards, call it a moral anti-realism, where you should think that there are no moral facts, right? It's then really arbitrary just to put them back in and call it brute. It's like, no, your worldview is inclining you towards nihilism. You need to give me a principled reason of why that should be avoided now. And for the listener, a brute fact is something that seems like it should have a deeper explanation, right? It seems very much like the type of thing that is not intrinsically completely intelligible, right? There's something about this that restricts its intelligibility, that we look beyond it to help make sense of it, right? But a brute fact says there's something like that, but nothing's answering the call for a deeper explanation, right? It's there. It seems to require a deeper explanation for why it is there or why it is the way it is, but too bad. It's just there, and that's the end of the story. That's a brute fact. And that relates strongly to the Leibnizian approach of cosmological reasoning, because one of the essentially the positive brute facts concerning contingent entities, somebody might say, well, maybe it's just like this contingent thing and that contingent thing and then this other contingent thing, and then we get to some final contingent thing, and it's just a brute fact. It's just there, no explanation. That itself is just a denial of the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason, as I would formulate it, really just says there are no brute facts like that, right? So those two things kind of, yeah, they're tightly related. If you think PSR is true, you should be looking for a worldview that can get the number of brute facts down to zero. And people deny the PSR because they're willing to just deem certain things a brute.
Well, so help me out here then. How do we explain that we know that we exist? I mean, because I've just heard some people say, well, it's just a brute fact that you know that you exist, right? I mean, what if somebody wants to say, I don't exist? And
yeah, well, I guess, I mean, let me try and be charitable. I mean,
sure.
Look, I'm all about steel manning and being charitable, but I think there are some positions of philosophy where you just got to be like, look, buddy, we have nothing more to discuss here.
Well, solipsism, right? Which I think is absurd.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think all of this is absurd.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to see how would you answer?
Well, I guess if you want to make a cosmological argument, you don't even really need I exist. You just need that something exists. And clearly there's awareness. There's awareness of existence, right? Even if you're saying that, like, I don't know, maybe this is some sort of illusionism with consciousness or something like that, right? That consciousness is an illusion. Well, then at least the illusion exists, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's just utterly incoherent to take that position. But either way, you're not going to get off of the launch pad, I think, for cosmological reasoning. But to my mind, if somebody's like trying to make, if this is in relation to cosmological reasoning,
just period outside of cosmology.
Yeah, that's an interesting and different epistemological and philosophical anthropological question. But I would say in the context of cosmological reasoning, if somebody's trying to get out of it by saying, "Well, I don't exist," you've won the argument, right?
Of course. But right. I'm just saying in relation to brute facts.
Yeah,
just in relation to that.
Right. So I would say a couple things. It depends where we're at, right? Are we using the first sort of method of cosmological reasoning, or are we using the second, right? So if we're using the first method, it's just going to be, if somebody's denying existence, forget just existence, right? I think that's going to be utterly incoherent for the reasons that we've already trotted out. But I don't think, and I haven't thought about this too much, I don't think you need any sort of robust sense of personhood or anything, or endurance of a substance, maybe. Well, you need that for reasoning. So that would be true. Like, you do need an enduring subject to engage in reasoning. So it would be definitely problematic for all of reason in general to deny that you exist. Like, there's no subject, let alone any enduring subject, right? Because there needs to be if you're going to move through a chain of reasoning. And then, of course, nothing's reasonable at that point, including the claiming that I don't exist, right? There's no way you could rationally affirm something like that, because you've just taken down all of reason. And I think this is very Aristotelian. When you're dealing with radical skeptics, largely the most you can do are rhetorician type of arguments to show that they're ultimately self-defeating, in a sense, right? That they kick the ladder out from under you that you used to climb on. And the other respect, though, positing brute facts is a cost in worldview comparison, right? So if you want to just say, well, it's just a brute fact, this or that thing, but the other worldview gives a deeper explanation, that's a reason to favor the other worldview, right? Because now we have greater explanatory adequacy or comprehensiveness, and the whole idea of worldview comparison is what can explain the most with the least. If somebody else is cashed out on a brute fact here, but we can explain it deeper over here, then you win, right? There's a reason not to take this worldview as seriously. And in fact, this one might be simpler, because brute facts are, they're increases in complexity, right? If you're just like sprinkling brute facts all over your paradigm, like, rainbow sprinkles on an ice cream cone, right? You're making your worldview very complex. And when it comes to worldview comparison, we tend to think of virtue as theoretical simplicity, right? We want our theory to have, like, fewer principles, if possible, at least on the fundamental level. And brute facts, like, it seems like those would be pretty fundamental to a worldview, and then you just have them sort of arbitrarily sprinkled on. That's really complex, seems highly improbable, right? There's probability reasons to reject something like that. So again, I wouldn't see that as a big threat when engaging in that method, because to my mind, you're just kind of giving it up to the other one. Yeah,
sure. But I'm just curious, because I know it is irrational and unreasonable whenever a person starts to question their own existence. But I'm just saying, does that then mean that you have to assume those things? You mentioned, well, it's unreasonable. Do you have to then assume reason to make this work?
Yeah, every argument has assumptions, right?
And is that a brute fact?
No. Well, if I'm assuming that I exist, right, to launch an argument, it is an assumption, but ultimately on one worldview, it's not going to be a brute fact, because we're going to give an explanation for existence. You see that, right? So yeah, it is a launch pad. That something exists is a launch pad. It's assumed, but ultimately the cosmological argument is meant to give an explanation of why does anything exist.
But are you also giving an explanation for reason? I mean, because we say again, it's unreasonable to question one's own existence.
Yeah, that's a great question. So reason, let's keep separate things separate here. So let's go back to worldview comparison. We might say reason is one of those data points that a worldview has to explain, right? It's a, and then we have to talk about, well, what is reason?
Yeah.
What exactly is that? And there's lots of theories out there. Just to give an example, you might take Plantinga's theory that, a belief is reasonable if it's sort of occasioned in us, in a line with properly functioning faculties that are operating in the environment they were designed to, according to a good design plan that was well built, well designed, and so on. He's got these various conditions, right? Well, that's an account of reason, and that's an account of reason that I think can be explained very well in theism, and that I do not think can be explained well on naturalism. In fact, that's essentially one of Plantinga's most famous arguments, is the evolutionary argument against naturalism. That whole argument is meant to show that the conditions for reason itself are undermined on a naturalistic paradigm where you have no God back of everything and purely Darwinian processes. Again, very technical argument. And it's not meant to show that naturalism is false. It's just meant to show that it sort of takes reason down such that you could not ever reasonably affirm, you can never be justified in being a naturalist, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And again, it ultimately comes down to things being just survival conducive rather than truth conducive, and how those faculties are built and what they're aimed at, or whether they're aimed at anything at all, and how whether epiphenomenalism is true, whether our beliefs are something that just sort of float atop, this underlying physical causal process, but don't have any sort of play back into them, if that makes sense. Sure. So no, I actually agree. I see what you're saying now, and I agree that reason itself is one of those data points that we need to analyze. What is reason, and what worldview can make the best sense of how it is that we have reason. And to me, it is undeniable that we have reason, right?
I agree with you. Yeah. But I don't know if I can explain it as well as you can.
I like how John Calvin does it with knowledge in general. He's like, look, guys, let's be serious. The fundamental question of epistemology is not whether we have knowledge. It's given that we do have knowledge, how is it possible? What are the necessary conditions for knowledge? And I think that's right. An analysis and then trying to search out the necessary conditions for it. I think if you're denying that we have these things, again, it's always going to be self-defeating at the end of the day. It's just going to kind of explode in a bomb of absurdity. So I think we have to realize, what's in front of us. We clearly have knowledge. Minimally, I understand the meaning of the terms that I'm using and you're using, right? We don't even have to go far to like various empirical knowledge. It seems on a very fundamental level, knowledge is undeniable. Now let's search out the necessary conditions for that. And that's a good project. Epistemology is not my specialty. But it is knowledge and reason are things within worldview comparison that I think need to be accounted for. And I do think theism gives the best explanation of those things, right? Mm-hmm.
And I want everybody to put some questions there in the chat. We're going to take questions in just a little bit. Make sure to put them to @Reason and Theology. But first, we're going to take a quick break here with a message from our sponsor.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.
And we are back. So,
we switched sides, man. I almost freaked out.
Yeah, StreamYard does that. But I actually like this one better because it looks like I'm looking at you.
Yeah.
We're kind of facing each other. But anyways. Yeah. So any others before we get to chat questions, any other approaches to God that you did want to touch on?
Yeah, so I think theism fares well whether you take either approach, right? Mm-hmm. Whether you take the more traditional kind of metaphysical approach or whether you engage in worldview comparison. I think, unfortunately, worldview comparison leads to a lot of confusions. But thinking about other arguments for the existence of God, the moral argument, I think, is a good one with qualifications, I would say. The way it's often commonly presented, I think can be problematic, such that if God does not exist, then moral facts do not exist, but moral facts exist, therefore God exists, or something along those lines, right? I think ultimately God is the best explanation, not just of moral facts, but moral knowledge too. I think we have to make sense of moral knowledge, right? That we come into reliable cognitive contact with moral facts. I think theism makes really good sense of this. The reason I'm a little bit more careful about moral arguments is I think it's a more complicated affair, and I'm not like a divine command theorist. I'm a pretty traditional in terms of how I think about morality from a philosophical perspective. Yeah.
And define the term divine command theory just for those who are not familiar.
Yeah, well, that itself is complicated because there's different camps within divine command theory, and some actually seem more compatible with my line of thought than others. But a cartoonish version we might be able to bring out by bringing up Euthyphro's dilemma. So Euthyphro, you go back to Euthyphro, right? And Socrates is talking with this pagan priest Euthyphro, and then this question comes up: hey, is something good because the gods will it, or the gods will something because it's good? Gods in the original, but we could just put God in there, right? And the divine command theorist might just be willing to, and by the way, both of those are sort of problematic for traditional theism, because on one hand, it seems to make morality arbitrary, which doesn't seem right. Like, it seems like rape is necessarily wrong, something like that, right? That it could never have been good for us to engage in certain actions, right? Or on the other hand, it seems to put something like over and above God, that God himself is not the supreme foundation and is back of everything, right? So the divine command theorists, you might think of them as somebody who's just willing to grab the pole that makes morality arbitrary, that if God just wills something, something is good because God wills it. There's this sort of making relation where God's will is what makes something to be the case concerning morality. And if that's what you mean by divine command theory, then I'm not on board with that. Sure. Now I want to qualify again before people protest rightfully that that's not all divine command theorists, right? And some, I think, are more in line with my position, which is broadly Aristotelian, and it kind of goes like this: that moral facts are ultimately grounded in the sort of essences and inherent dispositions of things, right? That what is good for us is determined by the kind of thing we are, ultimately our specifying potentiality, our species-specific potentiality. For us, that's rationality, right? We're rational animals, right? So we're perfected to the degree that we acquire the various virtues and stuff like that. And that's sort of what helps to ground the moral landscape, if you will. But that being said, I think the two fundamental pillars for that, which are essentialism and teleology, can themselves only be adequately explained by the existence of God, right? If that makes sense. So it's kind of like a two-tiered approach I would take to this. So I think if you're willing to work all that out, which is a considerable amount of work, then you can run a sort of moral argument. But notice that ties in what I said before. I think that bleeds into kind of contingency arguments, right? Yeah. So I've kind of had this thesis in the back of my mind that, does the moral argument sort of just reduce to the contingency argument at the end of the day?
That makes sense. Yeah.
And it might. I honestly haven't pursued the moral argument enough to make it.
But you're having to do more work there.
Right. Because at the end of the day, you're going to have to explain why any particular essence actually is right now and being directed towards a particular end. And then I think you're just kind of into a contingency type argument at that point. Yeah. Right.
That makes sense.
If that makes sense. Right. Yeah. And then what other arguments do I like? I actually do like Plantinga's stuff. For people who aren't familiar with Plantinga's account, we kind of outlined his account of proper functionalism and stuff like that, of what knowledge is and reasonable belief and stuff like that. And the kind of cool thing about Plantinga's project, and Plantinga's a Protestant, but there's many Catholics who've kind of adopted his project and showed how it's compatible with Catholicism and classical theism. Dr. Tyler McNabb would be a good example of that, right? That's cool because like it just sort of bypasses the need for any arguments, right? Because what Plantinga wants to say is that God is just one of those properly basic beliefs. It's not something that we need to argue up to reasonably affirm, right? If God exists and God gave us these faculties, and just belief in God is something that's sort of naturally occasioned in us, like the existence of the external world, like belief in other minds. And if Plantinga's account of reason is correct, then it's just going to be reasonable to believe in God under those sorts of conditions. So if God exists, it's reasonable to believe in God. If not, then not. So it's kind of a conditional there. But I think it actually solves a lot of issues, or at least a number of issues, especially epistemological issues. So it's not an argument directly for God, but I think it's something that's worth serious attention and study by anybody who's seriously interested in these types of conversations.
What do you think about argues that appeal to things like beauty? and try to work back to God based on beauty in the world. What do you think about that?
Not well studied in the matter, and I've given it a little bit of thought. And in fact, if people want to hear an attempt made for that, they can go to my channel, Philosophy for the People, and look at the recent conversation I had with Dr. Mark Spencer. He does think there is a path from beauty to God and beauty to theism. I'll just say I haven't made up my mind on it, so sorry to give an anticlimactic answer to that.
I know it's overly simplistic as far as the way I'm going to present it, but what would you say to those who say, well, in order to even speak of beauty, you have to have an ultimate beauty. Otherwise, upon what basis can we really measure one thing being beautiful or another? What do you say to that?
I think that's going to come down to Aquinas' fourth way, and if beauty is a transcendental. And that's the debate, right? If beauty is really convertible with being. If that's the case, then I think Aquinas' fourth way kicks in. And if people want to hear that, just go listen to my recent convo with Gavin Kerr on that. He's a specialist on that one. But it comes down to that. If beauty is it, and that's like a debate even among Thomists of whether now Spencer does think it is. So for him, it makes sense that he thinks that what you just said with a bit, with a bit more detail would go through and be a good argument. But I suppose if somebody denies that that is the case, then they might have an out. I would say, like, look, just like based on hunch, feeling, which I don't think count for nothing, even if they're not the strongest. I like it, right?
Yeah.
That wouldn't be the hill I die on,
Sure,
right?
of course.
But I mean, like, we know in the tradition, God is called, beauty itself, supremely beautiful, right? And I think there are decent considerations for why beauty is a transcendental. Gavin does not agree with that, by the way. So, a couple of my favorite Thomists are like at odds on this. Gavin says no.
Wouldn't it be like related to the same logic that you would use for beauty, you would also use for goodness? I'm sure Gavin would accept goodness as a transcendental.
He does, but he sees beauty as sort of emergent with goodness and truth.
Okay.
That's how Gavin sees it. Spencer doesn't see it that way, right? So yeah, beauty isn't everywhere being is, but once there's sort of, I don't want to make a caricature of Gavin's view, but once there's enough goodness and truth, then beauty emerges, right?
Huh. Okay. There's a really good question here from Nugloff. He's saying, how do you deal with atheists that a priori rule out argumentation for God, saying only evidence is satisfactory? My response is that existence is evidence, albeit meditately or immediately evident. And then he goes on part 2. David Haynes' essay on natural theology and precept is why I'm a precept. One necessarily must be able to experience outside of their interpretive schema in order to evaluate it.
Yeah, good stuff there. So again, context matters, but I would say a number of things. First, I try to ask them, well, what do you mean by evidence? Because typically when we think about evidence, we think of something that like confirms a particular hypothesis, right? So just to give a stock example, I go outside and my driveway is wet, and I sort of automatically form the hypothesis that it rained outside, right? But then I kind of look around, I realize like just my driveway is wet. And in fact, there's a hose next to my car, right? Well, then I start to revise my hypothesis and thank my wife. God love her. She washed my car, right? Why? Because I would expect to see the sort of restricted area of wetness and the hose there, if that hypothesis is true, because it's predicted by that hypothesis. And then you can ask, again, we're in the sort of worldview comparison thing, what sort of things does theism predict? And do we see those things out in the world? And I would argue theism is extremely predictive, right? It's predictive of contingent beings, conscious beings, being like us, reasoning beings. And so the fact that we see any of these things counts as evidence to whatever degree. Some of them, I think, decisive, others just, I think, strong considerations for the existence of God. I think that's the common sense way and the right way to think about evidence. In fact, theism entails strictly that something exists as God. So the fact that anything exists at all, I would say, once you understand the theistic hypothesis, is extremely strong evidence for God's existence, because naturalism doesn't entail that anything exists, right? Because it doesn't have that sort of necessary foundation, at least not a principled one, I would argue, that theism does. So I would just, again, try and ask for an example of what they mean by evidence. In conversations I've had, they throw this term out without any really clear or good idea of what they mean by it. And then if we're talking about hypothesis testing, then it's just a matter of saying, well, what would we expect under one hypothesis versus what would we expect under another hypothesis, and then just rounding up those relevant data points, right? I hope that answers the question. I don't know if it did or not.
Helpful for me though. We'll get clarification from him if it answers it. Alex the Thomas asks, question for Pat: any book on the ontological argument, especially referencing eternal verities?
So I would say I'm not a specialist on the ontological argument at all. I've always been intrigued by it. I think it can be used in conjunction with a cosmological argument to show how you can get brute facts to zero. So what I mean by that is the cosmological argument gives you reason to break the first premise of the ontological argument, and then from there you get this perfect being, right? But that means the ontological argument, in my way of thinking about it, depends on the cosmological argument, but it can play an important conceptual role in worldview and fleshing out your worldview. That's a separate point, but that's one use I've made of the ontological argument. Separately from that, I've read a few books on the ontological argument that I think were interesting, but ultimately didn't convince me of it. The most recent was Eugen Nagasawa, if I'm pronouncing that right. And, he's in the sort of maximally great being camp, and he wants to say, so I would recommend that. I don't think his view is compatible with classical theism, at least not obviously compatible, but I still found it to be an interesting and worthwhile book to read. I've read papers by Proust on it. And in fact, the book Necessary Existence by Alexander Proust and Josh Rasmussen has some advanced considerations concerning the ontological argument. And the last thing I will say, and this is probably the most relevant thing for somebody who wants a more traditional understanding of it, because going back to Anselm would be a conversation I recently had with Dr. Daniel Vecchio on my channel. It was called "Is the Ontological Argument Sound?" And he wants to defend Anselm's original argument as sound. And the way he presented it was a way that I was totally not familiar with before. And since then, this was a recent conversation. I've wanted to reconsider it. I got to finish other projects first, but now I'm like very interested in it, and like, okay, because before I was always, I don't know about you, Michael, but with the ontological argument, I was always like, I think how a lot of people feel about it. Like, this is either the most amazing and incredible thing that has ever come out of somebody's head, or you're playing some really funny joke here, buddy.
Yeah.
And like, couldn't like decide, like I felt one way or the other, depending on how much sleep I got. Right. But Daniel's way of presenting it really thinks that, maybe it is sound. I won't get into the details because I haven't studied it that well, but Daniel presented it on my channel. So that would be my third and free recommendation on that one. Mm-hmm.
There's another one here. What do you think of the argument from desire for God's existence?
Yeah. Again, I would say this. I would be modest about it. I would say, and it's okay, like you can say that there are good arguments in the sense that this seems to move the needle a little bit in favor of a position, even if it doesn't prove it, right? So that's it. Like Aquinas and metaphysical demonstrations, those are supposed to prove things. But in other conversations, we can just say an argument is something that just makes a position more plausible to some degree, whatever. And I think that's right. I think that if God exists, that we would have the desire we do. That makes a lot of sense. I don't think it's as expected on naturalism. I mean, of course, you can tell some naturalistic story of how belief and desires in God might have been conducive for survival, and those stories are told. But I always find them a bit contrived and not totally explanatorily adequate. And it just seems like we could have gotten along without any of those beliefs if naturalism is true. There could have been other entirely secular beliefs and secular coping strategies that were not religious. So I think there's a much higher likelihood that we would have this desire for God if God actually exists than if God did not exist. And if you think that that's right, then I think you should say that the argument for desire is a reason, even if not a decisive one, to believe in the existence of God. Was that clear, Michael? I don't know if I explained that as well. I could have, yeah.
Very helpful. This one is from Astrofire. How would Pat argue against someone, let's say a classical theist, who denies the real distinction of essence and existence in creatures?
Yeah, I guess I would have to hear the argument. I know that would surprise me that any classical theist, maybe what it is that there are some Thomists when it comes to Aquinas' De Ente that think that he did not establish the real distinction in his De Ente. And this is a big debate among Thomists, right? Thomists are kind of all over the board of like, where, if anywhere, does Aquinas establish the real distinction? Is it at that like first conceptual argument? So for people who aren't familiar, Aquinas kind of gives this one argument for the real distinction of essence and existence. I won't give it exactly. He uses a phoenix, but I'll give it a different spin on it that's been used by people like Oderberg and Fazer. That if you like went to some overly sheltered man in a cave and you described to him the essences of a lion, a unicorn, and a pterodactyl, and asked him, well, which one of these exists? Which one of these has gone extinct, and which one of these has never existed? He wouldn't be able to tell you without actually going out and taking a look in the world. And this is supposed to suggest that there's this real distinction between the essence and existence between any finite being like a lion or a pterodactyl or a unicorn. And there's objections to that. And even Thomists think that Aquinas wasn't really, he was establishing a conceptual distinction, but not a real distinction there. Oderberg has replies, important replies, where he thinks no, the real distinction is, or at least could be established there. So he considers those objections and he gives responses. And so does Klima, I believe, as well, argues that the real distinction is established there. My friend Gavin, also a very reputable Thomist, says no, it's not. In his book, Aquinas' Way to God, he argues the real distinction is established later on, and that's when Aquinas argues that there could be only one being whose essence is existence, and then where there's a multiplicity of beings, they're clearly not that fundamental reality, right? But given there is a multiplicity of certain beings, they have a real distinction between essence and existence, because there can only be one whose essence just is its existence, right? So that's Gavin's position. But there's other positions. Sorry to give a kind of brief rundown of the inner Thomistic baseball on this, but I guess people might find it interesting. I think it's Nassus, right? I think it's Nassus who says, yeah, I'm almost positive it's Nassus, but I could be fact check on this. He doesn't think it's established at all in the De Ente, but if I remember right, he thinks Aquinas does establish it elsewhere, and the 5 ways get you to God, and then once you have God, then you can go back and establish the real distinction. But as far as I know, and I could be totally wrong on this, I don't know classical theists who deny that there's any real distinction between essence and existence. And I would be careful about that, because if you're dealing with an individual, there has to be some difference between an existing individual and an individual. Countenance depart from their existence, right? If you try to eliminate the notion of existence, then there's no way to distinguish that individual from mere nothingness or possibility, right? And that's incoherent. If you try to reduce existence to the individual such that the individual just entails their existence, then how are they any more contingent, right? Then you've sort of eliminated the notion of contingency. So that's another way. Thomas doesn't use that argument. That's another way in my paper that I try to argue to motivate the real distinction. So yeah.
Good. Very good. Here's one from Nick French. Philosophical arguments for God and atheist apologetics in general aren't my strong suit. Any book recommendations or resources to study more?
Oh, this would I actually have a lot of books right here. Want to do a little show and tell?
Yeah. Let's do it. Sure.
Yeah. I'm not going to show you what it looks like over here because it's a disgusting mess, but I will pick up some books. So actually I had one that I was just referencing today. This is a great introduction. Now, it's not an apologetics book. It's an intro to metaphysics book, and it's called The One and the Many by Father Norris Clark, a contemporary Thomistic metaphysics. Now, at the end of this book, he does consider, the implications of the metaphysical system and how you can argue to God from that. But it's really what the book says. It's an introduction to metaphysics. I would highly recommend this for anybody who is interested in metaphysics, but also arguments for the existence of God. Here's another one I have handy. This one is definitely more advanced. This is Neo-Aristotelian Perspectives in Metaphysics. There's a chapter in here by Robert Kuhns where he develops a contemporary cosmological argument. Like I said, it's definitely more advanced, but if you want to kind of like jump into the contemporary debate, this is good. However, also in this volume, the first contribution is by William Vallicella, and he's defending Aquinas' notion of existence against the contemporary analytic notion, which is important for what I said was Barry Miller's argument. So that's, even though he's not running a cosmological argument, he's defending a position that is a really important step in certain cosmological arguments. So this book is relevant in those two respects. It's also just a darn good book for a lot of different metaphysical issues. I highly recommend this. Let me give this one I got not too long ago. I think it's quite good. It's new. This is the new Cambridge companion to Aquinas. And again, if you're just looking to get into Aquinas's worldview, his metaphysics, his epistemology, his philosophical anthropology, even grace and freedom. Interestingly enough, I don't think there's a cosmological argument chapter in this book, so I don't think you actually get an argument for the existence of God in here, but you do get a chapter on the transcendentals from our friend Gavin. He's a contributor to this, and again, it's a very good book. Let me offer something here that again is a little bit more advanced, but it will show what I think are. This is my favorite debate book. So sometimes you have these really good debate books where you take a kind of two top tier philosophers who oppose each other and you put them in conversation. This is my favorite one on the existence of God. There's a lot of debate books on the existence of God. This is my favorite one of all time. It's called Atheism and Theism. This is the second edition. And this is between Jack Smart and John Haldane. Now, John Haldane I referenced a little bit earlier in this interview. And I mean, this debate just covers, they're both great philosophical generalists, and it covers a range of different issues. But Haldane develops a very cool form of cosmological argument in this book, which I myself actually did a little bit of a study on my blog. I called the article Rethinking the Prime Thinker. He's got an argument for the prime thinker, which he identifies as God, and uses various different considerations to advance the idea that we need this fundamental self-thinking thought, this unrestricted thought of understanding itself, to make sense of how any of us actually possess concepts. But he uses like Aquinas's notions of causality and per se causality to get there. So that's probably enough for now. Sorry, Michael, I could go on and on, but those would be some good ones for people. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I appreciate those. And here's the super chat. Thank you. You convince someone to believe in God. How do then we get to the most holy Trinity?
Yeah, that's a different branch of apologetics, isn't it? Right? You know, there's...
Can, in your estimation, we get to a Trinity just by reason, natural theology, not actual supernatural revelation?
Yeah, I don't know. I probably lean more towards Aquinas, who said, no, this is something that's revealed. What we can do with reason is we can show it's not incoherent and it's not in conflict with other fundamental commitments like divine simplicity. I think he's right about that. But can we, from the armchair, just, roll up the flannel sleeves and prove the Trinity? I've never seen a case that has convinced me. I've seen a lot that have tried. Some people are like, well, God has all perfections, and this cooperative love of the Trinity would be a higher perfection. I don't find those ultimately, they're interesting. Don't get me wrong, they're interesting, sure. but I don't find them to be on the level of demonstration that you get with Aquinas's traditional arguments for the existence of God. I would just say, you get to the Trinity because you see that Catholicism affirms classical theism, and there's really good reasons to be Christian and Catholic, and the church teaches the Trinity, and God revealed it to us, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I agree with you. I don't really think, at least from what I've seen, that there's an argument that we could use just by natural reason to get to the Trinity. Mm-hmm. But somebody's asking you, are you on Twitter? Do you have a Twitter handle?
I am. Yeah, so let me say a few things about that in general, because I see the question is, am I on Twitter and do I engage in current discussions? I am on Twitter, at Pat Flynn COS, the letters COS, at Pat Flynn COS. I have a policy of not engaging substantially in social media. Why? Because it's not a good medium for substantive engagement, especially Twitter. So what I will do is if somebody brings up a question or an objection or whatever that I think is interesting or relevant, I'll do a podcast on it, or I'll make a blog post out of it. And my policy there is that, as I'm sure you've seen, Michael, you can get like 100 comments deep in a thread on something really substantive that nobody else sees, and you spent all this time. So if I think something is really interesting and actually worthy of consideration, I want to put it somewhere where more people will see it, and I haven't just spent hours of my time for one person that was probably not willing to be really
sure
open to argument to begin with. So it's a productivity measure. Like Michael, I run my own business. I've got 5 kids. I had 2 books I had to write this year, tons of articles. I just can't afford to be getting on social media back and forth. That's it. It's not to be rude. Some people have called me rude or ignoring people. It's not that. It's a decision I made many, many, many years ago, in fact.
I'm right there with you on that. Especially if I am going to respond, I don't want it to be lost on Twitter, in the Twitter sphere. I would want it, especially if it's going to be something meaningful that I'm going to spend time on. I want it to be available to a wider audience. So you're right about just go ahead and just do a show on it.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Always enjoy chatting with you, Michael.
I really enjoyed it. I got to head out here, but go ahead and put in a plug for anything that you want to and any of your contact information.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank your listeners for all the great questions. Very stimulating. So I run Philosophy for the People, and you can find me right on YouTube. Just type in Pat Flynn, Philosophy for the People, and I would love it if you guys subscribed. We cover all philosophical topics and perspectives all over the board, right? But we are doing so as Catholics. I say we because it's not just me. It's my friend Dr. Jim Madden as well, who should be coming back shortly now that his semester is finishing. So yes, we try to always be as fair and as thorough as we can, even with positions that we don't agree with. That's sort of our we see that as our duty, but at the same time, we're not shy about being Catholics either, right? Yeah.
Sure. Well, y'all certainly go and subscribe Philosophy for the People. I'll put a link there in the description. Once again, Pat, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Everybody, we'll see y'all later. Hit that like button and the subscribe button. God bless. Hey, RNC fans, just a quick word about one of our sponsors, Verbum. It's an excellent Bible and theological software. Simply go to verbum.com/reason, where you can get 10% off any of the packages that you choose, along with 5 extra books, and you'll be supporting us here at Reason and Theology. Oh wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/reason and theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.